Let's talk about globalization and what it is exactly. Now, the most important concept in globalization is the time-space compression. Take this map of the world in the 1800s, where the isolines are how long it takes to get from London to different points on the Earth within a certain amount of days. So you can see that London is pretty interconnected with the rest of Europe. It only takes 5 days to get to Russia, and only 5 days to get across most of the Atlantic. And 5 to 10 days to get through half of the United States. And it's less connected with, for example, Africa and Australia, taking over 40 days to get to the Australian desert. Um, Now, if you look at this map today, it takes half a day to get to a lot of the major cities in the world from London, as well as most of Europe, a bunch of the United States and Canada. And 1.5 days or just over it to get to almost everywhere in the world, with the exception of, for example, the Canadian Arctic archipelago. And the idea of the time space compression displayed by these two maps is that space is essentially shrinking because the time it takes for humans to travel across space isn't that long anymore. It only takes half a day to get from London to New York, for example. And that took like a full 5 to 10 days in the 1800s. And this just shows that the world is much more interconnected than it was before. Another example of this is global shipping lanes. And you can see that shipping lanes essentially funnel through major channels: the Panama Canal, the Suez Canal, the Strait of Gibraltar, Strait of Dover, the Strait of Malacca, and so on. And this is because these channels connect the biggest ports: Shanghai, Rotterdam, New Orleans, Houston. Uh, and you'll notice that there are a lot more shipping lanes in the northern hemisphere than the southern hemisphere. Now, partially this is because there's more land and thus more people, more ports in the northern hemisphere. But it also shows the inequitability of shipping and trade and so on, as countries like Gabon and Equatorial Guinea barely have any shipping lanes going to them, whereas countries like the US dominate trade. And this map displays that, you know, the world is interconnected, but some places are a lot more interconnected than others even today. Uh, The most major shipping lane in the world is the Suez Canal. It accounts for 12% of global trade, around 1 million barrels of oil, and roughly 8% of liquefied natural gas pass through the canal each day. The canal's revenues were taking a 14 to $15 million hit because the Ever Given blocked the Suez Canal. This was a 2021 event, I believe. Time's a little, funky 2 years after that happened. But it blocked the canal and, caused this massive backlog in shipping. And it caused big problems in global trade. Prior to the pandemic, trade passing through the Suez Canal contributed to 2% of Egypt's GDP, which doesn't sound like a lot, but that's a lot of money. And it's a major shipping lane across the world. If you take a look at flights as well, in between 2019 and 2020 on roughly the same day, it's a Monday or the second Monday in April. You can see in 2019 there were a lot more flights crossing the Atlantic, going around Europe. Europe and the U.S. are covered, but though the U.S. is still covered in 2020, Europe and Asia and everywhere else has limited their flights because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So this had massive impacts on the interconnectedness of the world, both in the sense of how people traveled around and got to places, but also how we connected, through online sources rather than through uh, visiting people through flights. Uh, and This brings us to international trade. Now, trade has dramatically increased over the past few decades, especially after the Cold War, when people weren't fighting over their economic system and only trading with certain countries. Trade has since opened and really uh, become a more international thing rather than just with alliances. Um, Principles of comparative advantage have largely taken over in trade, meaning that countries will specialize in one thing or a few things and only trade that one thing. So, for example, Saudi Arabia specializing in oil, or certain countries specializing in growing coffee and bananas and so on. Um, if you are better at growing that one thing, you can trade it for other things. So, if it's a desirable good, then countries will make it. Uh, for the basics of international trade, exports are what a country sells to others. Imports are what a country buys from others. Index of openness is how willing a country is to trade with others. So that's displayed by this map here. As you can see, some countries are a lot more willing to trade than others. So the U.S. is a lot less willing to trade than, for example, the Netherlands. Factors affecting trade growth include reduced trade barriers, communication, and transportation advances, as well as things like tariffs and so on. Patterns. So, high income countries tend to trade among each other the most because uh, they have the most money and a lot of tech goods. Uh, Countries trade with their neighbors because they're close. Dependency theory states that low and middle income countries rely heavily on higher income markets to support their growth. This is especially supported by concepts like the wheat trap, where developed countries will sign usually unfair trade deals with developing countries for certain cash crops and only make them trade that cash crop with them so that they can exploit that crop. Uh, Obviously, this is the dark side of the dependency theory, but it is an example of this theory. And trading blocks and set roads have become more popular. So, for example, China's Belt and Road Initiative, uh, which goes through the Suez and a bunch of other ports like Gwadar in Pakistan. Uh, and this is how China is planning on building its trade empire. Now, just a few questions for you to think about on your own time. How do you think COVID has impacted global trade, uh, especially during the earlier years of the pandemic, like 2020 and 2021? What sectors of the economy have thrived the most, and what sectors have suffered the most due to disruptions? And how has global economic recovery been so far? Especially, these workshops were made 2 years ago. Now, looking back, when most countries have peeled back their COVID restrictions, how has the world economy rebounded? Next, we'll talk about economic geography and global development, as well as some of the concepts within it. First, we'll touch on offshoring. So, this is when a corporation uses or exploits a country for its own interests. Some incentives for this include cheaper taxes, cheaper labor, and a lack of regulations. And essentially, uh, these corporations will use uh, developing countries for labor because the minimum wages are lower. So, for example, car companies, when NAFTA was signed, moved to Mexico often because the minimum wage was much lower than the United States and Canada. Another concept is the race to the bottom. This is the race for governments to deregulate and reduce tax rates in order to attract businesses. This is prevalent in poor countries, especially like in Bangladesh with their textile industry. They have decreased corporate taxes a lot so that corporations will come there and set up their textile factories there, and thus their population can, though unethically, their population can still make, a half decent wage compared to what they would make if they were farmers. But the important point here is the profit goes back to the home country because that's where all the executives are. So if a company from Canada builds a factory in Bangladesh, like Joe Fresh, for example, did, the wealth stays in Canada. It's not necessarily going to Bangladesh, though uh, their citizens are getting paid more than they would be working on a farm. Uh, they're not making like a living wage or enough for the economic value they provide to the company. Deindustrialization is a decline in industrial activity and employment in Western nations. This is especially prevalent in the Rust Belt in the US and Canada. So, the Rust Belt was obviously the main manufacturing hub for cars, for example, in the US, as well as in Canada, like Detroit, Windsor area. And it had a bunch of automotive and metals industries. However, once these jobs were offshored as a result of the race to the bottom, the areas deindustrialized. There was a loss of jobs, uh, a shrinking local tax base, and thus deteriorating infrastructure in these cities. This is perhaps best exemplified by Detroit, where a lot of places have been abandoned uh, in the city. Uh, this diagram shows the decline in population of major U.S. Rust Belt cities as a result of offshoring. Detroit is obviously the starkest decline. It had a population around 1.9 million in 1950 and was one of the largest cities in the United States. Now it's below 1 million, though recovering. Uh, Other cities like Cincinnati, St. Louis, Rochester, Buffalo, and Detroit were formerly or not Detroit. Uh, Other cities were formerly much larger than they are today, but again declined as a result of deindustrialization. Now, the recap for this workshop is to understand how and why urbanization occurs, know some basic fundamentals, i.e., zoning and gentrification, draw links between global development and urban environments, understand how geography and the global economy are closely intertwined, and be critical about the maps, models, and phenomena you see. What are their limitations, and how can they be improved? If you want to do some further inquiry, here are some sources that you could use. These slides will be provided. And thank you for listening. We appreciate your attention and hope you have a good time listening to the next workshop. Bye.